Thank you everyone for joining us in this last lecture of the series. My colleagues Michael and Ray and me would like to introduce you to the topic of costing at IRENA. So to show you a little bit of what we do, what kind of analysis we do, what kind of results we have obtained so far, in an effort to shed some light into the actual competitiveness of renewables. And we're very excited. We just released a very recent report, which very much updates and most of our data. So we're going to show a little bit of that today. So let's get started. As you may know, the whole energy sector is being completely transformed in the last years. So we have run into a series of policy support mechanisms, technology improvements, and which is our main task is to estimate the cost reductions that are going on. And all this has led to very interesting developments in the whole energy sector. Part of IRENA's work is working also on the benefits that renewables can provide, such as improvements in the economic sector and others. In this sense, we try to provide a balanced overview of what the benefits and the costs are for renewables in the global energy transition. What exactly do we do at the costing team at IRENA? First of all, everyone wants to know about the costs of renewables, and this is always being discussed, often debated in many forums, and our main task is to fill this gap in knowledge. In the early years of renewables, this was an even more difficult task because the deployment was thin, but now as deployment has increased, it's becoming more and more important to show with real data what the actual competitiveness of renewables is. So for this, we have built over the years what we call a world-class database, which actually contains a significant amount of project cost data that we have collected over time, so that we rely upon this database to produce our cost analysis. So from that data, we try to provide a little bit of added value and go deeper into the analytical part of it. For example, we show analysis on the learning curves of renewables. This is an often discussed topic as well. And others, we try to dig a little bit deeper into certain markets, certain technologies, analyze the cost reduction potential of different technologies, and we'll show a little bit of that. And so what has happened recently for renewables? As I mentioned, we depict a lot of these results in this recent report, which you can find online and download it for free. It shows some of the latest trends in the costs and performance. We provide global results up to 2017, and for some regional and country basis, we also have 2017 data, but mostly up to 2016. So we provide cost indicators such as the levelized cost of electricity for all major renewable energy technologies on a global basis, so the geographical scope is quite large. And we're very happy that we have managed now to integrate also a database of the auction results. As you may know, recently many markets are shifting to auction systems for renewables, and this has, in a way, it has generated lots of headlines in the news about how the cost is reducing. So we try to integrate this analysis in this report as well, and try to compare it with our existing database that we have over the years. The interesting part about the auctions database is that it can provide some light into what the future the immediate future we take a look at 2020 to 2022 projects, because we know some of the costs from that auction database that will be are planned to be commissioned around those dates. So, and this chart actually shows some of these results. Maybe I'll just show here. For example, you see the technologies that we cover. As you see, it's quite comprehensive. In this one, we just show the trend, the actual change from 2010 to 2017. Some of the cost reductions are quite remarkable, an example being solar PV. As you see, coming from 0.36 LCOE in 2010 to around 0.10 in 2017. And in this shaded area shows the fossil fuel cost range that we estimated recently, mostly based on OECD countries, but quite representative of the global average. So you can see that increasingly renewables are, maybe I should explain a little bit. So each of these circles is a project, and the size of the circle represents the capacity of the project. Now the lines show the global weighted average for the technology of the LCOE in US dollars per kilowatt hour, so that you can understand it better. And so we see that, you can see there that the renewable energy technologies are increasingly being deployed at levelized cost of electricity that are within or often below the fossil fuel cost range that you have seen in the shaded area. So for variable renewable energy technologies such as solar and wind power, cost reductions have been also remarkable in the last years. So they are increasingly falling in this competitive range. And we expect from the analysis that we did from the auction database and others that all commercial renewable energy technologies, including CSP, concentrated solar power and offshore wind, can be competitive by 2020 to 2022 as compared with fossil fuel power generation. Oh, okay, no problem. So I'll just show some highlights of this analysis, comparing these. And then you can see as well here the element, in this case, what you see here, onshore and solar PV compared. So you see the blue one is the LCOE database, and the orange one is the auction database. As I mentioned, the interesting part of the auction database is that it also gives us a hint into what the projection of the cost can be towards the future. And you can compare there as well. Lots of deployment for solar PV. We have lots of cost data for that. Now for offshore wind and CSP, which I was mentioning earlier, we can also see, of course, for these two technologies, deployment is thinner. So the amount of projects that we have in the database, of course, corresponds to that and is not as high as for the other technologies, but already we can see very interesting trend, and you can see increasingly, as well for the future, you can see costs that are increasingly below the 10 cents per kilowatt hour threshold for these two technologies. So we expect that for the range of 2020 to 2022, these technologies will too be competing around these cost levels. So, as I mentioned, the deployment has been thin, but for the level of deployment that these technologies have had, the cost reduction levels have been remarkable. So we, as I mentioned before, we do as well try to do a little bit of analysis on the learning rates. So this is a typical concept that has been used in the industry for some years about how costs can evolve with increasing deployment. So the learning rate is defined as the cost reduction with every doubling of the cumulative capacity of the technology. You will see here some estimates for CSP, for the 2 solar and 2 wind technologies. For example, the offshore wind learning curve we estimated at 14%, onshore a little bit higher at 21%. CSP, you can see here, of course, they all start at different levels in terms of the cost, and the deployment has evolved a little bit differently for each technology. But solar PV has the highest learning rate at 35%. That means for every doubling of the cumulative capacity that is depicted in this axis here, you can see a 35% reduction in the LCOE, which is depicted on this axis here. And this is, of course, indicative of the potential cost reduction for each technology. Often it has happened that let's say we estimate the learning rate at this point, given the data that we have at this point, and we can say, okay, solar PV can have a learning rate of 35% according to this data, which is kind of like the slope of this. When you plot these 2 curves on a log-to-log basis and you estimate the slope of the line, you can estimate the learning rate. But it has happened, for example, in the case of PV, that the learning rate estimates have slightly changed with time as technology has improved, even, let's say, at higher rates than what previously analysts have expected. So, and here we can see for the 4 technologies compare how increasingly, as I mentioned, the projects are falling within the fossil fuel cost range, or even below. You see lots of onshore and solar PV projects projected to be below the fossil fuel cost range from 2019 onwards. So this would be like a general overview. As you can see, we cover almost all renewable energy technologies in this report, and I will now go a little bit deeper into each technology, starting with PV, which is a very interesting technology. Actually, as you know, solar module prices have decreased tremendously in the last years. Alone from 2010 to 2016, we can see a really remarkable decrease. This is the cost in US dollars per watt for a module sold in Europe. And these are the different types of technologies for different modules. So broadly speaking, we have crystalline modules and thin film modules. Now, in the earlier years of PV, the share of crystalline and thin film was more even, but in the recent years, crystalline technology has been more dominating. So, but anyway, for all technologies, you can see a quite stark decrease in costs, which was one of the main drivers for the overall levelized cost of electricity decrease for solar PV. Now, in this report, we also show a little bit of the individual country trends up to 2016, and you can see interesting changes there. Despite this overall trend of reduction in module costs, solar PV module costs, there are still some stark differences among different markets. This has to do it's not easy to explain. It corresponds to lots of different factors, one of them being the import treatment. As you know, some markets, as Europe, have some import constraints. But here we can see that already in 2016, a range of 0.43 to 0.61 per watt could be shown in these markets This is another issue is that the market coverage for PV has been increasing and increasing because more and more countries are deploying solar PV. Here we show the install cost of utility scale PV. So this is the large scale solar PV plants in US dollars per kilowatt. All our figures are depicted in 2016 US dollars, so that we can also compare on the historical level what the actual cost basis was, let's say in 2010 compared to 2017, with taking out the effect of inflation. So again, here each project is represented by the circle, and the weighted average is shown here in these bars. We see in 2017 the overall global weighted average cost of total installed cost of solar PV was more or less $1,400 US dollars per kilowatt, which is still an interesting decline from 2016 values. Of course, not at the same levels of reduction that we saw in the earlier years, so it has stabilized a little bit in the last years, but still continues to reduce, and this relates more to technology improvements, for example, efficiency improvements, new cell architectures in terms of different construction of the cells, different cell concepts, for example. But so while in the earlier years, most of the cost reduction potential from solar PV came from module cost reductions, and there's still some potential for that now. More and more total installed cost reductions are coming from the so-called balance of system costs, which I will present a little bit more onwards. So you see, in terms of country levels, of course, Chinese and German projects are very competitive, so are around 1,100 per kilowatt in 2017. Here we show a little bit of a flavor of the differences among countries, but in general terms, we can see that in terms of total installed cost, we can see a decrease of up to 68% on average. So some countries decreasing within the time frame of 2010 to 2017 in terms of total installed cost, more than 70% cost reductions, for example. Even in Japan, which still remains a little bit on the high end of the costs, total installed cost, but the reductions have been really stark. And so, as I said, but still there are some differentials. So with, in this chart, it's a little bit of a, this chart shows for 2015 and 16, comparing, it's like an index compared to the costs in China, which are here represented as a benchmark. This is the absolute levels in terms of US dollars per kilowatt. So more or less 1,100 in both years. And comparing those to in each country, you can see that comparing to Chinese levels, in 2016, which is depicted here in the orange ones, you can see a cost reduction of broadly from -9 to around 80% in the larger cases, which has significantly been a narrower range than in 2015, where the range was much more higher. So you see slowly all countries are starting to converge around the Chinese level cost. Of course, not reaching it, all of them, but getting closer and closer, and the broad range of costs that we saw in the earlier years, 2014 and before, is starting to get smaller and smaller. And so we expect these cost differences among markets to continue to decline, so that they start to converge more and more. Here we show a little bit more detail. I won't go into every detail of this, but broadly speaking, for each country, we depict the individual cost components of the total system costs. Now these components consist of three broad areas, which are the hardware costs, chief of them amongst them being the module, and then the installation costs, which include electrical, mechanical installation, and other quite important costs called the soft costs, which include all the rest of customer acquisition, financing costs, for example, and also the margin, permitting. Permitting is a very important cost concept in the world of PV. And then, so here you can see the difference among costs and the structure of the cost. So we try to go a little bit deeper into what is actually driving the cost reductions, and for that, we try to analyze these cost breakdowns, which are a little bit challenging to get, because, as you know, cost data may be a little bit sensitive. So, from this, we can learn that for those countries that are actually more competitive, which are on this end, and as I was mentioning before, the BOS cost reductions have been more important, and especially you can see here around this cost. If you take the BOS cost, so-called balance of system cost, so we take the total system and exclude the module and inverter costs, right? These two, and then you have the total BOS costs. So you see, for these markets that are very competitive, broadly speaking, more or less they have a BOS cost share of around half of the total cost. But you see other markets which are not so competitive still have a relatively higher share in terms of BOS costs, because in the end, the module costs are the ones that are starting to narrow more evenly and more rapidly in the different markets, although there are still differences among markets, as we've shown previously. But it's more about how to work on the installation costs, how to work on the soft costs to achieve these best practice levels. As you see, Germany is very competitive in these. One of the aspects that is very competitive in Germany for this is the installation costs, because of the long history of Germany installing solar PV modules systems. Most of the processes have been very much optimized. There's also a lot of automation in the process of installation. And there are not too many, comparing to other countries, there are not too many geographical hurdles in terms of the installation process. So, in terms of the levelized cost of electricity, here we don't show the total install cost, but now we show the cost of electricity generation with PV, but the same concept, showing the weighted average here. So you can see a 73% decrease during this time period from 2010 to 2017 to a level of 0.10, as I was mentioning earlier, here, around 0.10 USD per kilowatt hour. And still continuing decline from even from 2016. So this is also interesting, because even the LCOE has not stabilized, of course driven by some reduction in total install cost, but also, as you can see from the global perspective, there are more and more projects on the lower end as well, and the narrower range comparing to this broader range. This shows the 5th and 95th percentile cost of the projects. So you see these ranges also have been decreasing. For example, in 2010, it was between 0.18 and 0.60, but in 2017 it has decreased to 0.07 and to between 0.07 and 0.3 US per kilowatt hour. So part of it, there's diverse reasons for this, but part of it is as well as the global PV market has grown and reached newer markets that often have higher radiation. This has also allowed for lower LCOEs in the global weighted average basis. Typically there's a lot of analysis on the large-scale solar PV, mostly because in the early stages that was the data that was available. But now increasingly as the PV markets grow globally, we're taking a look at the other segments, which we will also talk about. In this case, I want to show an example of the commercial segment, which is increasingly gaining in importance in different markets. So we see quite a diverse selection of markets here. Some are at the high end in terms of costs. Some of the US markets and the UK, for example. Here is shown the total installed cost in US dollars per kilowatt. As you see, the data for commercial costs is a little bit more, let's say, less uniform than for the larger scale utility level. You see a little bit of differences in terms of when the data first became available. But in all cases, you see quite interesting, remarkable cost reductions. So some of the low-end costs in 2017, this is quite recent data from the first half of 2017, second quarter, are already very close to utility scale, larger utility scale costs for PV projects. So we see a similar trend in that. Some examples for Germany, we see costs of around 1,100 and 1,150 per kilowatt for China. So this is very, very close already to the best, let's say the best in class utility scale, larger utility scale costs. So increasingly we see economic opportunities in the commercial sector being seized by the different project developers, and also different stakeholders getting more and more involved in the commercial sector, installing PV and installing PV projects. So this is similar, but showing the levelized cost of electricity. Now here, of course, the irradiation levels that also affect the capacity factor of these plants plays a role, so that is not entirely one-to-one relationship, as you can see in this one. So the lowest LCOE average can be seen in Australia, which has quite low total installed cost, but very good irradiation resources. So that is possible then to reach these low LCOE levels. And some of the, in terms of LCOE, some of the UK and some US markets are still on the high end, almost twice that level that can be achieved in the low Australia projects for around 0.10. So here around 0.20, the 0.20 level in this recent in 2017. In terms of the concentrated solar power technology, I'll just briefly introduce it. This CSP technology may consist of different sub-technologies. So main ones among them being the parabolic throw technology and the solar tower technology. There are some others, linear Fresnel and the dish shielding technology, but these are, in terms of deployment, they are not so important so far. And the trend is moving more and more towards solar tower technology, although parabolic throw projects still continue, new parabolic throw projects continue to be being built. But in general, the CSP technology deployment is still quite low compared to other technologies, may be around the 5 gigawatt mark globally. But even for that low deployment level, the cost reductions have been interesting for CSP, so that it still gives a lot of potential for the future. Our main analysis, as I mentioned, focuses on these two technologies. And then the solar towers have a good cost reduction potential because they work with higher temperatures. And now increasingly for CSP, CSP is an interesting technology in that it allows for thermal storage to be added to it and gives added capabilities to the technology for dispatchability. So this can potentially add more value to the generation. For example, in scenarios where there is interest to deploy high shares of renewable energy. So this added value of dispatchability has caused that actually in the last years, almost all CSP projects have been deployed already with at least some hours of storage. You can see that here. This shows the project costs from, so the same, each of these is one project, more or less from I think it's from 2009, 10 to 2016. Here you can see the total installed cost levels and just the trend, how it has evolved. In here, it's a little bit, you don't see an immediate downward trend like we have seen so far, because here also the other variable of the amount of storage, of thermal storage included in the plant is included in this. And it's compared to the capacity factor. That means the real output of the plant compared to the theoretical output it could have. But so, of course, adding this adding storage can cause increases in the total installed costs of CSP. But also, it can cause increases in the capacity factor of the plant, because the plant can provide more electricity comparing to the total installed nominal capacity that it has. So this is a little bit of a, let's say, an engineering design decision that the developers take. But the trend, as I mentioned, was, as you can see as well here, the trend is towards higher shares, higher number of hours of storage. As you can see here, from 4 to 8 has been decreasing, and even some projects have up to 9 hours of storage, depending on it depends a little bit on the use case of this electricity sales agreement, let's say like that. So, in overall, the range has been quite broad for up to 2016 for CSP of around 2,500 to 11,300 per kilowatt for systems with no storage. But as I mentioned recently, more and more projects are being built with storage. So this has increased a little bit the cost, but the range has been a little bit narrower in the sense that it goes from 6,000 to 13,000 more or less per kilowatt. Now, the story of CSP is a little bit interesting. The cost decreases started more or less in 2012, because initially lots of projects were being built mostly in Spain, because there was a quite generous feed-in system in Spain around that time, and that draw lots of attention for this type of investments. But as in a way, it could have cost as well a little bit of hype in the cost of CSP, and then when this shift started to move away from Spain, we could see already lower costs for CSP. Here is shown the levelized cost of electricity, again, in US dollars per kilowatt hour, which has, in 2016, it could be, we estimated the global average to be around 0.27 US dollars per kilowatt hour, which is already quite about a fifth lower than in 2009. But for 2017, we estimate a little bit of a continued cost decrease, up to be around 0.22 per kilowatt hour, with costs of around 5,500 in terms of total installed costs. For the future, as I mentioned earlier, the auction database already is showing a much starker downward trend, which is increasingly falling for CSP around the fossil fuel cost range. So if we take that, of course they are not directly comparable, but they are a good point of reference. And we can expect levelized cost of electricity from CSP to be around between 0.6 and 0.10 per kilowatt hour for that period of 2020 to 2022. Oh, and then I'll let Andre to continue with hydropower.
Good evening. Thank you, Pablo, for introducing and for your presentation so far. So my name is Andre Ilash, and I'm also working in a costing team. And I was thinking, while staying there, is that I'm sure, in all justice, I'm sure that a lot more accomplished researchers have given lectures from here. So I hope I get some goodwill from you, because it's I feel a bit constrained to speak from this pedestal, where usually professors at age 50 or 60 give lectures to such big audiences. So I hope you'll be nice to me. And before going further, because we are talking about all these trends in costs and so on and so forth, and metrics, different metrics. Are you familiar with LCOE? Anyone knows what it is, or do you have any? Okay, capacity factors, does it tell you anything? Okay, so I'll do a brief overview of this before, again, deep diving into the technology. So the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, is a key metric in energy cost analysis. Basically, it's the lifetime costs of generated a unit of electricity from an asset. You have the costs of constructing an asset, the cost of operating it. You discount all the costs with a discount factor to account for the cost of debt and the cost of equity, and you divide all these costs by the energy produced by that asset, and you get a number, usually per kilowatt hour. And this allows you basically, why it is so easy to work with this kind of metric, it allows you basically to compare different technologies and to see which one is more competitive on this sole metrics. So it's a very easy and widely used metric in energy cost analysis, and that's why we are also using it. In terms of the capacity factor, basically it gives you an estimate of the likely output of an energy asset, which is very important, because that's how in the end you find out the kilowatt hour cost from that asset. So with this being said, coming back to hydropower, it's a very, let's say, it's an old technology that has served us well in the past 50 to 70 years. Well proven, well tested, widely deployed. Most good sites have been tapped already. There's big dams, as you know, and it has some of the lowest cost LCOE. At excellent sites, projects can deliver costs as low as 2 cents per kilowatt hour. This is by far the least expensive renewable energy technology out there that, as I said, served us well for quite a long time. Lately, what we've seen is actually, because of most of good sites have been tapped, there's a move towards trying to exploit less prime locations in terms of resources. And this development in more challenging locations has been reflected in capex and LCOE increases over the past 5 years. As you can see here, the total installed cost or capex, and the same evolution for levelized cost of electricity. Going further, in terms of regional evolution, the weighted average LCOE of hydropower is below 10 cents per kilowatt hour in almost all regions, ranging between 4 and 6 cents per kilowatt hour. The least expensive hydropower is observed in Brazil at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, and the most expensive in Europe and Oceania at 11 cents per kilowatt hour, mainly due to lower quality resources, as in this areas more primary sources have been already tapped, as I have previously explained. Next, we have trends in bioenergy. In bioenergy, we've seen a shift towards more sophisticated bioenergy plants in terms of technology, and thus the LCOE of newly commissioned projects has increased over time, reflecting these technological choices, as you see here from 2010 to 2017, which has reflected further on in the levelized cost of electricity evolution. Going further, so the wide range of bioenergy-fired power generation technology and feedstock costs translate into a broad range of observed LCOE, as you can see in this graph, from around a low of 0.4 cents to a high as almost 25 cents. The weighted average LCOE of biomass can be as low as 5 to 6 cents in India and China respectively, and 8 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour in Europe and North America, reflecting what I was telling you before, the more expensive technology choices and the more stringent environmental regulations. Continuing with geothermal trends, what we have observed in a nutshell about geothermal is that the LCOE of geothermal power appears to be trending downwards, starting with 2014, in line with the general decrease in installed cost after 2014, mainly or in part accounted by less pressure on drilling prices after 2014. Yeah, and now to more interesting news and technologies, since I also work more on wind. It's a fascinating evolution in wind observed over the last 3 to 4 decades. Basically, the deployment started in 1980s, late 70s to 80s, and we've seen tremendous technology improvement and significant cost decline over the years. Wind turbine prices have declined by half in 2017 as compared to peaks observed in 2007 and 2009. Better technology has allowed developers producers to build wind turbines with higher hub heights and with higher rotor diameters. And in the end, capacity factors, the amount of electricity a wind turbine is able to produce, has increased significantly by a third over the period from 2000 to 2016. Yeah, in terms of the levelized cost of electricity, as I was saying, tremendous cost declines by more than 85% between 1983 and 2017. We have also noted offshore wind cost LCOE decrease, with projects stemming from auctions and online in 2020 to 2022, which will be in the band of 6 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Offshore started at a higher price than onshore wind, of course, because of the difficulty of setting up wind turbines at sea, not on firm grounds. But very exciting developments are happening in the offshore wind industry. As you might have heard, that even in Germany, for example, there was the last auctions. There were offshore wind projects that will basically receive no guaranteed payments. They will be exposed only to revenues from merchant power markets, basically from electricity trading. Pablo has introduced you a bit to the concept of the learning curves, which is a widely used concept in industrial economics. And basically, as he said, we try to assess the estimate of the percentage reduction of installed cost and LCOE every time installed capacity doubles. At IRENA, we gathered a very big data set, over 4,000 wind farms, accounting for more than 300 gigawatts of onshore wind, deployed from 1983 to 2016, to assess the learning curves of onshore wind. This data set accounts for 85% of global installed capacity at the end of 2016. In our data set of 12 countries, we have seen cost declines of between 38 to 68% of installed costs. The largest one being in early adopter countries like United States, Denmark, and Germany. And the learning rate we have estimated for onshore wind at the global level is at 9%. So basically, every time installed capacity doubles worldwide, onshore wind has declined by 9% up to 2016. More important news is that even if we've seen this tremendous cost decline, there's still room for cost declines for technologies such as onshore wind. Better technologies, as I have said, translated into higher hub heights and bigger rotor diameters, allowed for wind turbines to be able to produce more electricity, which has increased the capacity factors, in some cases by basically doubling it, as is the case in the US, which is a early adopter. Going further in terms of the LCOE, we have observed in the same data set a decrease by 89% in the US and 81% in Denmark from beginning to 2016. And we have estimated a learning curve for the levelized cost of electricity at 15% over the period. Thank you, and this was my part, and I will now leave the room to our senior analyst, Michael.
All right, so good evening, everyone. Apologies for being late. Traffic is a complete disaster today. I've been somewhat delayed. You've had my colleagues, Andre and Pablo, take you through a lot of detail. Now might be a good idea to actually see if you have any questions for us, a few. Otherwise, we'll go on and we'll talk a little bit about, not just talking about the data, but some of the stuff that we're doing with the data that's trying to help our member states be more ambitious by showing them some of the exciting things that are happening. So if you have any questions for us at this point, please, there's one to start us off.
Thank you for the presentation, and it was very informative. So I have a question especially on hydropower. You mentioned that there is like a price difference, like a cost difference between the small hydros and the bigger hydros. So depending on your studies and analysis, or I don't know if it will be included in this analysis, do you think the cost is it's coming from the production cost or the market cost? Like, is it more of production or market?
So the difference for small hydro is typically the project development costs represent a larger proportion of the overall costs, and the other issue that they face is the electromechanical equipment. So the turbines are proportionately more expensive for smaller sizes. So it's a combination of those factors. As you've seen from the data, though, there's a very wide range, and some small hydro projects can be very cheap and others can be very expensive, and the same is true for large scale. But on average, the small scale ones are more expensive.
So it's not about the market where, like, once they produce it? Okay.
No.
All right, thanks.
So perhaps down the back quickly and then around. We'll do a triangle.
Hi. I want to ask why you so often assume a linear relationship between the data when most linear approximation has shown to be quite off in the last decades. I was quite shocked when you showed that the solar power would drop in a linear fashion. I would more expect it to drop in a exponentially, you know? And I think this prediction could be kind of dangerous.
So for the, in terms of, was this the initial, some of the opening slides? Yeah. So those, in terms of the learning rates, those are just average values, obviously. What we've seen for solar PV in particular is it depends a lot on which time period you examine, in fact. So you can generalize in that there have been 3 periods for solar PV where there have been significantly different learning rates. The initial period was relatively slower. There was a reversal with the polysilicon price shortage in 2006 and 2007, and then since then we've entered into a much more rapid phase of decline. So the short answer is that if we try to explain that to policymakers, we've already lost them. So unfortunately, a lot of what we do is keeping it simple so that we can actually get the overall message across to policymakers. But you're quite right, it's not linear over the entire period, and for solar PV in particular, there are 3 distinct periods.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Pablo Viernes from ABB Power Consulting. I have a question regarding the previous slide. You showed a comparison between different capacity factors, I think it's the other one, this one, among the years, but I don't know if this is the correct manner to compare the capacity factors, but because the capacity factors depends on the location of the wind turbines. And the second question is related to this LCO value, because I don't know if you consider, for example, the ancillary service like ramping rates or ramping capacity and other problems related to the variability of the renewables energies.
Yeah. Okay, so the level, in terms of the capacity factors, these are the capacity factors for newly commissioned projects in a given year. It's not the, if you like, the stock average capacity factor. It's only for newly commissioned, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is a mix of factors here impacting on the capacity factor, average capacity factor for those projects. One of it is the technology being employed, and the second is the average resource quality for that year. In an ideal world, we would control for both those variables and have an understanding of what is coming from the purely technology side, what is coming from the resource side. Unfortunately, that is very difficult to do and very data intensive, so that is something we leave to our member states who have more resources to perhaps funnel to research institutions to do that kind of thing. It's very interesting, and we had a plan to do that for the entire 12 countries we have the best data for, but it's just a mammoth project, so it's off the table. In terms of the LCOE, this is a static metric of the cost. It doesn't talk about the value of generation. Obviously that varies depending on the electricity system, the existing distribution of generation assets, demand, and whether there are markets for different ancillary services as well. So a separate exercise has to be done in terms of the energy planning to look at what's the optimal mix of technologies moving forward. We're just talking about indicators of cost, which is a useful metric to start looking at which technologies you should consider adding to the system. Right, so with that, we might get moving on. We have the opportunity for more questions at the end as well. So what I want to talk about is a little bit something about the very exciting ramifications of these cost reductions and the fact that, particularly for solar and wind, we're now looking at very competitive costs, even undercutting fossil fuels for a substantial number of projects today or in 2020. So with that comes a lot of questions, obviously, about how do you integrate variable renewables and so on, but at the base, it's an exciting opportunity to maximise the use of what if something has become very cheap. So part of that is looking at how we can inform policymakers about the opportunities. And so we've done some work on rooftop solar PV to basically try and take some of our raw data and convert it into some metrics that we can talk to policymakers about just how, what an economic opportunity for end-use consumers rooftop solar PV is now that costs have come down. Now there are a lot of issues around what's the balance of distributed to utility scale projects that you want to see in a system and how the costs are distributed, but there's some pretty exciting things going on. In the United States, there are often time of use tariffs. You'll pay a different rate of electricity depending on how congested the system is. These are static, they're fixed a year ahead, but their idea is that they tell you about the value of, or the cost of electricity at a different point in time. You can see here in the hours of day in summer and winter, the different rate schedules in blue and red, and in yellow you see the solar PV output. And what you see here is that on average, the value, if you like, to the consumer, and this is for San Francisco customers, is higher than the average value that they'll be paying for electricity, because solar PV falls within the ramp rate, particularly for summer, of the higher electricity. There's another thing going on here which is not so obvious with the different blue and red bars, is that in fact California has the most complicated time of use tariffs in the entire world. They're actually, in theory, they're designed to help you understand the value of electricity and the cost and act accordingly, but actually it's so complicated the average consumer has no idea what's happening, and it took us 9 months to figure it out ourselves. But on the left-hand side, you can see that as you go through the month, if you consume more, you start going to a higher tier. So it's not just about when you're consuming, it's also about how much on average you've consumed through the month. I'm not quite sure why they justified this, but on the left-hand side you can see you go from tier 1 in grey to tier 2, 3 and 4 as you go to green, blue and orange. If you put in a solar PV power on your rooftop, you actually reduce your consumption, so all of your consumption falls within that first tier. So not only have you saved electricity when you're self-consuming at the peak price, for the first tier, you've also stopped moving on to those higher tiers. So the economic benefit for a consumer in California is very high before taking into account any financial support, which is significant in the US, which helps to explain why in the United States, despite the fact that they have very good solar resource compared to Germany, their levelized cost of electricity, the black lines here, remains above those of Germany. And we'll look at that in a minute. But here you can see, first of all, the decline in those black lines between Q1 2010 and Q2 2016. So again, very similar to what we've seen at a utility scale, 40 to 65% cost reduction for the electricity generated. At the same time, in blue, you can see the average effective electricity rate while the solar PV system is generating. In Germany, that's the same as the average rate, more or less, but in California, for all those consumers on time of use tariff rates, it's actually significantly above what the average electricity tariff rate is. So the average in California is around 13 cents. The average retail price paid by all consumers is around 13 cents. But when you're on those time of use rates, except for Los Angeles, you're significantly above that due to the distribution costs. Most of the cost reduction has been driven by the reduction in installed costs. But you can also see here why there's such a difference in the levelized cost of electricity. The black bars, are circles and are at California installed costs, and the blue bars are German average installed costs. And you can see they've both come down over the time, but California prices remain significantly higher. The total installed cost there is significantly higher. There's some structural reasons from that in terms of cost differentials, additional permitting, expensive, but a lot of it is simply because they have such generous financial incentives that there's no pressure for anyone to push down the prices. Compare that to Germany, which has one of the most competitive installed costs structures for residential in the world, and the fact that there's not a lot of sunshine in Germany suddenly is less important. So two extreme examples we've taken, but two very interesting ones because of the competitiveness of Germany for installed costs and the time of use tariffs for California, and this policy implications obviously from that. California could do a lot better, and the US in general, in being more efficient with their policy settings, removing non-tariff barriers like these permitting processes, the delays of 6 to 9 months to get connection agreements, etc. So it's a good way for us to speak regularly to policymakers and talk about the good news that's happening, particularly around the PV costs having fallen, also that Germany is a very competitive installed cost market, and there are lessons for that from other countries. So for instance, we're also helping Japan understand why their costs are also significantly higher than in Germany. So working with them to understand in terms of the balance of system costs, how can they bring down their costs and get more bang for their buck? And so even though the feed-in tariff in Germany has declined significantly, solar PV is still a pretty economic choice for most residential households. And you can see here on the right-hand side a chart that we put together for the period July to November last year for newly installed capacity. So over 31,000 systems going in. It's a lot less than what was happening in the heyday of deployment, but still a significant amount of small-scale solar PV. I mentioned earlier the very exciting opportunities in the energy transition with very low-cost solar and wind. That opens up a lot of things that we need to think about or worry about, depending on your nature, in the future. As I mentioned, one of them is finding uses for this very low-cost electricity. Will we see Saudi Arabia become a large exporter of ammonia produced from solar PV? It could happen with the very, very low costs they've had quoted for solar PV. Similarly in Australia. But the other thing we need to think about is how do we manage a system with a lot of variable renewables? So some facilitating technologies become very interesting in that respect. One of them, which gets a lot of press, is electricity storage. So we looked at the costs and performance of that. And electricity storage is quite an interesting but also challenging topic because there are a lot of drivers. It's not just about what's happening with solar PV, it's also what's happening with the use of batteries and electromobility as well. So for us, electricity storage is an interesting topic because it cuts across a number of different parts of the energy sector and contributes in different ways and different timescales. So electricity storage, like solar PV, is very modular. You can put it in a lot of different places in the energy system. You can put it behind the meter, pair it with your rooftop solar PV. A distribution company can put it at its substation to delay investment upgrades. If new suburbs are being added, transformers might need to be upgraded, you can put in distributed storage to delay that investment until you have a nice economic chunk of transformer capacity you could add that's going to be utilised, not having a large capacity underutilised for 5 years until the suburb comes online. As I said, you can also be used in electromobility. It can be used on the utility side as well to provide ancillary services, so frequency response or arbitrage, or to aid with the ramping of solar PV and variable wind as we move forward. So today is a very simple story about electricity storage for stationary applications. It's virtually all pumped hydro storage, and you can see that on the blue bar on the left-hand side. If we look on the right-hand side to all the rest, even all the rest, batteries are still a pretty small proportion of what's going on, so the electrochemical in green. But that's going to change rapidly, as we all are aware. And part of that is because costs are coming down. So there's something happening in the energy sector that's happening over and over again. We have modular, replicable technologies that are being industrialised, and they have a project development process that is easily replicated as well. What happens? Costs come down, performance improves. It's not rocket science. It's pretty complicated, and Pablo knows a lot more than I do, so I won't get into the details of the batteries. But in Germany, 60% cost reduction in the space of a very short period of time, but since Q4 2014, and that's continuing to come down. In terms of some of the key findings from the analysis we did, there are significant continued cost reductions that we will see out to 2030, 50 to so half to two-thirds perhaps. At the same time, we're going to see performance improvements. So when you combine the two, obviously the cost of the service you're providing is going to fall much faster. There's a lot of different electricity storage technologies. There's lithium-ion batteries, but there's different types of lithium-ion battery chemistries. There are high-temperature batteries, sodium-sulfur batteries. People are still talking about compressed air energy storage, etc. Because of the range of services electricity storage can provide, we feel it's a very open field. So we're not ruling out any of the technologies. It's not like for electromobility, where lithium-ion batteries have pretty much cornered the market and are likely to stay that way. And overall, we could see a 2 to 3 times increase in the electricity storage market by 2030, if we're going to stay on a sustainable path for the energy sector. And because battery storage is in its infancy for stationary applications, the growth could be much more dramatic, so 17 to 38 times. And I mentioned earlier that there's a range of technologies, so we're going to also see a range of that growth of the market tapped by these different technologies. It's worth noting that don't forget about lead-acid batteries. They'll be around for a little bit longer. They're also being industrialised to a larger extent than they have been in the past for stationary applications. Their performance is slowly improving, and of course they have a bit of an advantage in that there's a lot more operational experience in their use. which is an issue when you're developing new projects to use electricity storage. High temperature batteries, sodium sulfur batteries, these are primarily produced by a company in Japan. They could also see their cost and performance improve. And obviously, we haven't talked about, well, we've talked about lithium ion. There's a range of chemistries, the more promising chemistries we looked at. But there are also flow batteries. They're interesting because they can truly separate the power capacity from the storage capacity, because you're using basically an electrolyte in a tank which you can scale. Whereas batteries, lithium-ion batteries, there is a range of optimal ratio from power to capacity in kilowatt hours that you can have. And there's a lot of things going on that are driving this cost reduction and also the improvement in performance. This is nothing new if you've looked at industrial innovation and R&D developments, but basically what's happening is it's all being compressed into a very short space of time, and we're seeing for each individual technologies a lot of research going in and a lot of industrialization, particularly in China, looking at becoming, as they want to do, a major player in battery development. So we've looked at each of the technologies and we've dived down a little bit deeper into what's driving some of these cost reductions and performance improvements, and also tried to give more of a flavour for those that are more interested about which applications they're more suited to. Are they more suited to energy arbitrage? Are they more suited to providing some of the more rapid response ancillary services where you have to charge and discharge rapidly to maintain frequency on the system, etc. So to go into a little bit more detail, but not too much either, because everything is happening very rapidly. So what we released last October is not completely out of date yet, but already is in need of a bit of update. So we don't want to go into too much detail. But as I said, the key thing here is that across the range of technologies, what we're seeing is performance improvements and cost reductions. And you can see that here in terms of the increase in life cycle equivalent that can be obtained from these different electricity storage technologies, and on a reversed axis, the reduction in installed cost in energy terms, so per kilowatt hour on the right-hand side. So if you combine these, of course, the cost of storage is coming down. It's still not hugely economic in a lot of applications yet, and so we'll talk about that now in terms of the market outlook. Electricity storage is one of these topics where there's a lot of confusion about when we need it, where we need it, and how much it is therefore going to cost us in the energy system. The good news is that if we are to achieve the energy transition, we're going to need a lot more energy storage, and as we deploy it, the costs are going to come down and it's going to cost less. So I spoke earlier, we're going to go from around 4.7 terawatt hours of storage today to perhaps 12 to 15 by 2030. We did a couple of scenarios on what it might look like. Pumped hydro storage will grow in blue, but it's not going to hold its own. There's a lot of other things happening in terms of what's happening with passenger EVs in yellow, concentrating solar power with thermal energy storage. If it really takes off, could be a big chunk of the flexibility we need to incorporate solar and wind going forward. In terms of the economics, it's a really tough sell on the utility scale. There are niche applications where it can stack revenue streams, so it can do a little bit of energy arbitrage. It can get some revenue from frequency response or the reserve and stack these revenue streams and be economic, but it's a tough sell. But increasingly within the next few years, rooftop solar PV paired with electricity storage will be very competitive from a consumer's perspective without financial support. This will happen in Australia probably in the next year or two. because they have very high electricity rates and a fantastic resource. It will come a bit slower in Germany, given the slightly poorer resource. So that's the early mover, but as costs come down, we'll increasingly see economic opportunities on the utility scale. And so that's where we see a balance, at least by 2030. And here's, I mean, you can look at the report if you're really interested, but there's some additional detail on what we think some of the services it's going to be providing are as well. But it's 2030, it's relatively speculative, but at least it puts in context some of the growth. So electricity storage we see as a very important technology, and it's going to be at the heart of the next phase of the energy transition. It's most needed in different parts of the energy system at different times. So the end-use sectors where we've done a pretty terrible job of decarbonising means that electromobility is a very important opportunity in the next 5 to 10 years to try and push down transport emissions. Longer term, as I said, moving into the utility space on the power generation side, providing ancillary services, but also some of the flexibility we need for higher shares of variable renewables. As costs come down, a lot of this is going to be driven by the economics. As we see, I saw someone calculating the Tesla battery charging and discharging in South Australia last week. And they charged for about a gigawatt hour of electricity, and they made $1 million in a week because selling it between low and high priced periods last week. So that's going to have a very rapid payback. So in specific markets, batteries could have a very economic opportunity, but it's not necessarily going to be driven by the fact there's very high shares of solar wind. EVs are likely to dominate longer term the total electricity storage capacity. That has important implications for the sector coupling. If we do the charging of EVs badly, it's going to cost a fortune. If we do it right, it can help us integrate solar PV. So it means we should think a lot about vehicle-to-grid technologies and how that might work. As I said earlier, different applications, different technologies. There's a lot of opportunity, at least on stationary applications, to deliver a range of technologies and different applications. So that's a very long, high-level yet too detailed discussion of what we've been doing, looking at the costs and performance of renewable energy technologies. I'd like to thank you all for your attention and the opportunity for coming here and taking some of your time to share what we've been doing. We find it, although it's a little bit on the techie and geeky side, we're very passionate about what we do, and we're pleased to have this opportunity and come and share some of our work and enthusiasm with you. And we'd be happy to take any more questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if IRENA does sort of comparisons between fossil fuels and renewables, including the battery storage, on sort of a life cycle basis, because you hear a lot of talk about how the batteries aren't actually that great either, because they have to be produced and then they land on a landfill somewhere. You probably heard all that talk too, so I was wondering if IRENA does also calculations into that direction.
Yeah. So IRENA has a very simple statute, actually. We're here to accelerate all forms of renewable energy in a sustainable manner. So we take great care to ensure that what we're proposing falls within that remit. So we have a separate piece of work that looks at things like end of life for renewable technologies. We did a report on the end of life for solar PV, and the next thing we are going to be doing is on the end of life for batteries. So solar PV, and except for thin film, is relatively is not particularly a big issue. There are much more toxic industrial waste we have to deal with, but batteries are a bit more tricky. And there's, going forward as well, if we're going to reduce the demand on materials, the reuse of the materials in the batteries is important as well. What typically, so we're very keen on the sustainable end of life component, where we also, we like to underline that, if you like, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions analysis for different technologies is useful but can often be misused. So if the goal is to decarbonize the energy sector, worrying about the other inputs which are carbon intensive is good if you're worried about the short-term pathway. It's not so useful if the goal is actually to decarbonize those inputs as well. So you need to have a second step which actually looks at what those implications are as well, and avoid the risk of double counting. But so we do try to take all of that into account. And as I said, it's particularly important for lithium-ion batteries from a materials perspective.
Do you think lithium-ion batteries would die off because of Samsung's new invention, the graphene popcorn battery? I think it could be a better implication. And don't you think you should stop people try researching that direction, more in the more graphene, like not so environmentally bad direction?
Well, lithium-ion is not necessarily particularly bad for the environment. As I said, there's a lot happening in terms of the electricity storage space. And so we restricted our focus on the commercialized technologies that are likely to be scaled up in the next few years. There is every possibility that we can throw all of that research out the window in 5 years' time. But there is a long product development cycle that exists for these commercial technologies before they can scale up. So something that's announced today as hopefully working in the lab may take 10 years before we see it at scale in the market, is the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider is that we've had a lot of wonder breakthroughs in the last 10 years, and not a lot of them have actually come onto the market. So I'm also a little bit, until we see working applications, rather than statements by a company that has a reputation to improve upon after recent experience with their batteries, let's wait and see. But there are a lot of exciting avenues that would help shift us off as well the performance and development track of these existing lithium-ion chemistries, which will also at some point be important.
Hi, thank you very much, all three of you, for your lectures. My question was about grids, actually, and the relationship between this learning curve and the ability of the technology to integrate into the grid as it exists, or how much the grid has to come halfway to the technology.
Yeah. So this is one of the pleasant things that we've had to deal with over the last couple of years. We've stopped talking about if solar and PV can play solar and wind, can play a big role as to how much can we fit into the grid and at what cost. So if you have a relatively well-developed grid and you're relatively well interconnected, you can incorporate a lot of variable renewables. So we had the CEO of 50 Hertz at our assembly 2 weeks ago, and so last year they had 51% variable renewables. So these are figures which people didn't consider reasonable, even 5-6 years ago. So The first thing I think it's important to remember is that with the energy transition so far, at least from a renewables perspective, all of the problems we've worried about at a certain point have often started to fall away once actually industry gets involved and businesses try to figure out how to make a dollar from it or stay in the game. So, you know, the short answer is yes, we need to look at all this in a great deal of detail, but my gut feeling is that a lot of these problems start to fall away if the regulatory and institutional frameworks are right, and there is a good faith effort by all parties to actively integrate renewables. If you don't have that, then everything suddenly starts to look very difficult. Now that's a gross simplification. If you start to go down to more isolated grids, or ones that are very long and skinny, that have a lot of grid constraints, then the issues change dramatically. So there you have to be much more careful about ensuring locational signals for the deployment of renewables so you don't end up with trouble. You need a good overall arching grid infrastructure plan to strengthen it where necessary. You need to bring in the demand side, which we haven't talked about at all today, because that can get you a lot of flexibility as well. And then, you know, at the end of the day, it depends a lot on what existing flexibility you have as well in the system. So it's the next frontier in terms of the discussion, and we're hoping that it'll be less complicated than we anticipate.
Yeah, thank you. You showed a couple of examples of renewable technologies that are either cost competitive or are becoming cost competitive at the moment. I was wondering about the pace. So is the market itself fast enough so that we should see an energy transition that leads to climate stabilization as envisioned by the Paris Agreement, or do we still need government action? Do we need more incentives? Which incentives do we need?
So the pace, globally, the pace of change that we're seeing is totally inadequate. Partly that's because we're not moving fast enough in the power generation sector, where we have had enough, you know, which we feel is on the right track, but not changing fast enough. But mainly because we haven't adequately started to address the end-use sectors. So Germany is a very good example. You know, there was a slight blip in the CO2 emissions upwards because of the end-use sectors. So the power generation sector is, okay, not going as fast as we would like, but it's the fact that most countries haven't really addressed the end-use sectors properly. That's why we think electromobility is very important, because it gives us an early pathway for transportation. But buildings and industry still need a lot of work. And we need to do that sooner rather than later. That can be partly about incentives, that can be partly about making science-based policy, phasing out individual technologies and then letting the market figure out what's the least cost solution. So it doesn't have to be about incentives. That has been a preferred route for many countries because it is less threatening to incumbent technologies. But the short answer is we're nowhere near on track. We have the right technologies. No? Okay. Right. Well, thank you all very much for engaging with the questions as well. This is the last in the series that we've done, so we would like to, first of all, thank you for coming, particularly if you've come to all of them. We appreciate your dedication. As I said, for us, we really enjoy coming here and being able to share with you some of the research that we've been doing. So we'd like to thank the International Department here at the University of Bonn in particular, and all of the members there that have helped to facilitate this. It's been much appreciated from IRENA's side. One thing we will give you some homework though. We are interested in finding out what you found useful about these lectures, what we could improve on, or if we should just stop coming. actually. So you can be perfectly honest, it's anonymous, but we'll send out a SurveyMonkey questionnaire sometime in the next week or two, and we'd very much appreciate it. We try to make it short. Very much appreciate it if you could fill that in. So thank you very much.